Welcome to Multidisciplinary Approaches to Resilient Landscapes. I'm Sarah Beck, the Executive Director of Pacific Horticulture, and you are watching a virtual event series event that was recorded on July 14th, 2022. We're honoring multidisciplinary innovators who are solving the climate and horticulture challenges of today. This event is called Doxiadis and Teremoto, Mortal Humans Enduring Landscapes, a Dialogue. Do overly managed landscapes express fears of mortality and a false sense of stability? This not overly controlled dialogue between members of the Doxiadis and Teremoto landscape architecture teams explores leaping towards more naturalistic and resilient landscapes. We are welcoming Thomas Doxiadis, Eva Bercianu, David Godshall, and Alain Peauri. We'll start with each team sharing a bit of a rapid fire explanation of some of their work, their values, and their approach.
Alan and I are the founders of Teremoto, which is a 20, what is it, Alan? 24-ish, 3-ish?
Yep, 24, 25, you never know, some days.
Yeah, 23-ish person office. I run the Los Angeles office with Jenny Jones, and Alan runs the San Francisco practice with Story Wiggins. But all that being said, we always like to show this slide of the happy family office because it's a team. And I don't say that in a way that's, I hope, not sanctimonious or disingenuous, in that we are a team that, and actually we'll probably avoid getting into office structure, but we're a soft hierarchy and everyone has a seat at the table. And we just want to be, to express before we dive into it and show you our work, that all the work that follows and a lot of the ideas that Alan and I are going to kind of pontificate on are also the ideas of everyone on the team as well. These are a lot of the way we think about garden making is emergent through conversations as an office. Rather than talk specifically about certain projects and how we built them, we're just going to blast through a bunch of slides that explain ways that we practice. And I'm just going to kind of toggle through the images quickly. I'm going to make you talk in a second, Ellen. But I would offer that one of the subtexts that kind of guides our work is using local materials and keeping our details simple. We believe that there is great beauty to things that are simple and straightforward. And in terms of thinking about making complicated machines, that landscapes can be designed as really complicated machines. And we try and push away from that and try and make landscapes that are honestly as simple and straightforward as possible, and while also hopefully being intellectually rich. We believe that a thing can be made intellectually rich while also being really simple and modest in construction. Keeping our our gestures and projects very elemental and letting them age and letting them be expressive of where they find themselves, their particular place in the world is kind of utmost importance to us. And we believe that through using local materials, and when I say local, historically, we kind of tried to use the metric of 250 miles, but increasingly we're trying to make projects that come from whose materials are literally the embodiment of the place in the earth in which they find themselves. And then kind of through curating them and reorganizing them, of course, we give them purpose and meaning. That's kind of one subtext that kind of permeates through our work. So this image, for example, these paths were made from redwood that was coming from less than 50 miles away. And we worked very much hand in hand with the builders to kind of create these paths that, though clearly of a hand and of a point of view, that also in their materiality embody the spirit of where they find themselves in the world. And then that's going to dovetail into mostly native planting. Alan, do you want to do planting?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have a kind of a strict guideline of 70-30 native to maybe exotic plants, just to give some sculptural moments at times. But for the most part, we try to use mostly natives and mostly regionally appropriate plants on our projects.
We've also found that sometimes in California, at least, and I'd love to actually hear your point of view on this, Thomas, because we live in different places that have been developed and settled through different patterns. So I'd love to kind of get the point of view coming from the Mediterranean or Greece as well. But we've found that through the using building mostly native gardens, what happens is that the gardens become bigger than just the garden. Of course, it is about our client and it is about the homeowner and the way that they can use the space. But what using mostly native plants does is it equates human use with use of local birds, butterflies, insects, lizards, all these things. And so the gardens become bigger than just like the land on which they find themselves, in that birds move through properties and animals move through property and water and soil. This is a project that Alan's team, Story, did in the Bay Area. And you see a mix of like native sages with also like, what's this plant, Alan?
Dateria or something?
Datura, thank you. Datura radii, which is kind of this native that is endemic to really the southwestern half of the United States. And we think that there's beauty to making plantings that, though curated, are kind of like evocative of the greater region in which they find themselves. So that's the native planting. Land and labor. Alan, you want to touch on that quickly?
Yeah, we're just trying to represent our contractors. It used to be that we would kind of bring down the cost before we presented the bids to the clients who always want a deal. But recently we found that if this is what the project costs, this is what the project costs. So we just send it along as soon as we get it. And then we, tell the clients, this is what your project costs. We can take things away to make it cheaper, but we're not going to cut their income based on your desire to have like a certain cost project. So, and yeah, just being like, stand up for our builders, basically.
We found that historically speaking, in the United States at least, there was oftentimes an adversarial relationship between the designer and the builder. And from like the outset, we were kind of like, we're not going to do that. We want to make allies of the people that are building our landscapes and advocate on their behalf. And it's always been slightly disenchanting to us that a lot of work, really you can get like these monographs and there's no like, there's no acknowledgement of the fact that these beautiful landscapes in whatever book you're looking at were made by human beings, and that those human beings have their own kind of skill sets as well. And so the erasure of the contribution of the laborer, depending on where you are or look at it, is kind of like, a passive systemic classism or racism, depending on where you might find yourself. And so we're just calling that out. It was just like a thing that internally we're constantly trying to look at the totality of the systems that go into making a garden, and labor is a big part of that. And so we kind of we have an ongoing initiative and working group within our office that's kind of firing on different fronts. It's a journey. So it's manifesting in like articles that are showing up online and also in conversations that we have with our clients, and we're just trying to do better. And then I'll kind of wrap it up there so that we don't take too much of the airtime and that it turns into the conversation that we're so looking forward to having.
Perfect. So we'll flash through things quickly as well. So we have good time for a conversation. What we'd like to think we do, and the focus of our thinking is that, humans have had an antibiotic relationship to everything else and sometimes to each other for a bit too long. And we're hoping to kind of be part of the wave that is trying to turn the culture into a culture of symbiosis and a kind of win-win between, among humans and between humanity and everyone else. We find ourselves, well, we are, as David said, a team in everything that we do. And, everything that we think is the result of teamwork. We usually find ourselves in the position where clients, buy properties in amazingly pristine areas. And what we're called to do is sort of restore the damage caused by the practice of architecture. But this particular client who bought a property in the middle of a nature preserve that's kind of, has snakes. She said, if any of the snakes appear on my property, I'm never going to move into the house. So the project turned into a snake kind of fortification project. and we ended up working with the University of Athens herpetology department and prepared various strategies, etc. But at some point she said, she was presented with a budget for the various snake trials, and she said, well, we don't need to do that in the end. And we were wondering, was it the expense, or had she started to become accustomed to the place? But ultimately, we find ourselves very often in conditions where people kind of, decide to create houses in quite beautiful and very natural places like this. But in fact, the kind of landscape they ask for is almost an extension of the indoor, something completely controlled, and the stuff we don't like to do and we don't think is the right thing to do. So we're wondering what the problem is, and we've kind of come to the result that part of the problem is utopian thinking, which in generally one would think is a good thing. We all love utopias. Utopias kind of start with the Garden of Eden, where everything is perfect, people are living in harmony, they don't need food or clothing or anything, and they don't die. And the story, we're sent out, and ever since, in sort of the whole Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, but also in various Eastern traditions, utopia has been understood as a kind of Garden of Eden. And at the same time, the history of gardens is a history where people have tried to create utopias as understood by their culture at the time. So the gardens have been an embodiment of utopias, all the way to kind of the social utopias of the 19th century. The problem with the Anthropocene is that people tend to have these great ideas, and then they project them out onto the landscape, regardless of what is already there. So, they're very often exercises of domination, of change, but it's been, we're worried about humanity, a humanity that is taking over more and more of the planet and having more and more power to create the face of the earth. If this is our cultures, or part of the culture's idea of what the future should look like, we're a bit worried. And then there are also the very powerful sort of other types of social utopias, such as the Dynasty, for those of us who are old enough to remember. And I'm old enough to remember that when Dynasty appeared, all the houses around Greece started looking like silly little dynasty houses. So underlying all of this, we feel might be the fact that when humanity was kind of supposedly sent out of utopia, one of the things that we met was this guy. So we know that our cultures have a huge issue with death, of not recognizing it, which means in the end that I think part of the reason we are called to do landscapes that always look great, always look fresh, always look like it's springtime and never look like it's winter or the dead of summer, is this great difficulty to accept that things are cyclical and that death is part of the story. That being said, go really quickly into 2 or 3 projects. One is a 22 project that has been running for 22 years, and it is on the very beautiful sort of pristine island of Antiparos, with landscapes where you really wouldn't want to change anything, but a lot of development is coming in. So architects tend to imagine that houses land, beautifully designed houses land beautifully on a landscape, but in fact, the actual construction process is quite destructive. So on this map, we have the first 10 of a total of 25 large villas with the amount of construction land that is destroyed. And we ended up developing various strategies. But basically what we did is we spent a lot of time understanding what is going on site. What are the natural forms and structures? What are the man-made forms and structures? And what are the processes that are happening here? So, after becoming really good students, we kind of started developing various techniques that I won't really go into, about how things how new things can be integrated into these old landscapes. And fortunately, most of the architects played along, and we had a very good kind of collaboration at various levels. And eventually the developer and the contractors played along, and we had good collaborations about, from minimizing disturbance to, learning from the landscape and bringing it in to, surround the various buildings. And a long process of introducing native vegetation, collaborating with a small nursery on a nearby island. And again, developing various strategies that have to do with mainly doing a bit of artificial planting and allowing a certain degree of natural revegetation. And of course, learning like real characters, the native plants, and using them as much as possible, and experimenting. It's a project that has allowed us to experiment with many things, among which, what do you do if you really have to do irrigation free in areas that have 200 mil of rain per year or less, which is almost the desert conditions. So a few before after photos of construction, and then the result after landscape is finished. And I think my favorite story here is that the project has gained recognition internationally, but it's also kind of bombed in many competitions. And the usual comment is, we don't understand exactly what you did here. What is you and what is nature? And we're thinking, well, if you don't see the difference between what was here and what we did, fantastic. But I guess we don't get credit for it then. And another very quick and different story is a crazy little experiment we got into for the Venice Architectural Biennale of 2021. How will we live together was the title of the Biennale, and there were 4 sub kind of themes, and one of it was at the scale of the planet. How will we live together on this multi-species planet? And we have a long kind of love and hate relationship with fungi. So we picked an area in the Biennale which is already the walls are already kind of infested with fungi, and fungi, I guess, not the things you eat, but the actual minuscule organisms. And we wondered, how can you make something which is so important, because without this kingdom, none of us would be alive. How do you aestheticize it so that people understand it and start to appreciate it? And it became an experiment of actually collecting the fungi from the walls, and with air traps, cultivating them, again with a collaboration with a crazy and wonderful mycologist from the University of Athens, and learning how to deal with fungi as if they were plants, which they absolutely are not. And after a lot of failed experiments, and with the Biennale being kind of pushed back by a year because of COVID, we started learning how these characters operate, and started becoming more and more having more and more agency in kind of putting them to play. And finally we kind of managed to put on a good show, I would say. And this is Eva in the center, and basically created an empty room which just had the sounds of various things in the animal and plant kingdom, and just light leading you into little, almost a religious experience of the, I guess, a little fungi garden. And these are alive, so they have a life cycle of 6 weeks. So we had to kind of keep seeding them and letting them grow, and then starting the process all over again. So that's our 2 things to throw out there to get the conversation going.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And I really want to allow this conversation to continue. And I think, both teams probably have some questions or some response to each other, but I'd like to kick that off by just saying, some of the things that you just mentioned, Thomas, that were very interesting, talking about, this false sense of control in managed landscapes, and some of the work you've done really with very climate resilient landscapes that people are having these cultural reactions to. And I'm curious, kind of, what does this make you think in terms of cultural change, or what's needed as far as cultural shift, as you're both being responsive to a landscape and designing, but also perhaps changing the public perception of, what their expectations for landscape are, so that we're not having people say, well, I don't see what you did there. Isn't that just nature? I mean, which, I thought those are really, it must be strange to have people criticizing you for being as good as nature.
I would say something a bit, anyway, my experience is that in the about 25 years that I've been working, I've seen a huge cultural shift. In Greece, for example, 20 years ago, you talk about landscape and landscape related issues, and most people would have absolutely no idea what you were talking about. Now, most people kind of get it, or get some of it. I'd say that, the mentality has moved into the 90s or early 2000s. So I'm glad to see that the culture is changing, but it's, it's not changing nearly fast enough. I think it's way too slow for the kind of issues that we're facing as a planet.
I would second that, and it can be frustrating sometimes, but at least in the United States, we're trying to, at the very least, lead by example in terms of what ecologically appropriate, and actually not even ecologically appropriate, taking it a step farther than that, like environmentally gracious gardens, like what those might look like. And hopefully that in terms of like, I feel that at least in the US, there's like an emergent collective sea change going on, where everyone's starting to understand that the stupid grass lawns that everyone has outside of their house, which really like came of age in the post-World War II development of the United States, which at the time kind of, to say it makes sense would be too kind, but it made sense at that moment in time far more than it does now. But what I think a lot of like homeowners and or landowners, whether the projects be, or even like cities, what people are oftentimes struggling with is that people are generally acknowledging that the grass lawn and foundation shrubbery is no longer appropriate given everything. I think what's oftentimes disorienting to the lay person who doesn't have a deep understanding of garden making is what's next. And so, and it can kind of be, rightly, it can be perplexing and confusing to people to know what direction to go in. And so to the best of our ability, we're trying to make gardens that we can point at and say like, this is what's next, and here's why, and do so in terms that aren't necessarily esoteric, because oftentimes when it's a thing, I'm sure you deal with this, Thomas, too, but sometimes academia can make things more intellectual than they need to be, and in doing so we lose the interest of the people who matter the most, which is like the public. So anyways, rambling thoughts, but we are optimistic. I feel like so many people reach out to us now and say like, we don't want that other thing, we want this new thing. So it's a moment of great change, but it does need to happen way faster.
You mentioned models, and I think that's really a nice direction to go in this positive angle of showing people examples. I'm curious if from any of you, if there are some interesting innovations in design right now that you're excited about or you're seeing happen, just in terms of, and you can be as specific as saying, how turf is being replaced with something else, or what do you think those exciting innovators are doing right now in that space?
Native plant nurseries. I don't know, it seems very analog, but they seem to be the people that we're going to need to go to in the future for sure, to keep water use down and to keep kind of landscapes flourishing in appropriate ways. So I would say native plant nurseries.
And to extend that, I know you all touched a little bit on your process and support of businesses. I know there's a lot of issue around native plant nurseries not really being able to ramp up production without, you know, having enough business guaranteed, especially with, you know, specific species where, you know, you may want a lot of something, they can't necessarily produce it unless they know there's demand. Are you getting into any of those conversations around, you know, just helping support helping those businesses to actually be able to expand their production?
Yeah, we're kind of allied with Theodore Payne, the Theodore Payne Foundation, which is a native plant foundation and nonprofit in Southern California, and doing everything we can to like bolster their mission and bolster like the reach that they have is a thing that we do. And I would also even touch on, you're saying like in terms of cutting edge, we're also living at an interesting moment where I think because of climate change and because of all these things, we're also grappling with the perils of the hyperurbanization. And in a way, I think cutting edge would be the wrong word, but returning to indigenous wisdom that coexisted with the land in a way far superior to what we've done in the United States is a thing that we're doing through both engaging with land conservancies, and Alan's team has worked with Cafe Olone in a design process that was wholly different than ways we've done in the past. But we'll stop talking, Thomas. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, my thoughts is that what makes us most excited right now is the gradual realization of the importance of soil. You know, down to the Chelsea Flower Show, which might be the most kind of staid, you know, gardening event anywhere. You know, their title I think this year was "It's Soil, Not Dirt." So, and also, I would say our experience maybe has been favorable because we've been asking for native plants for the past 20 years and we're getting them. So by now the nursery trade has revved up and is providing them. And I'm wondering though, David and Alan, isn't the kind of the drought in California an amazing opportunity to, you know, to have an explosion? What I like about the US, and it's not the same everywhere, I can guarantee you, is that when things change in the US, they change quickly. It's a culture that can just go in 5 years, can change 180 degrees. And I think California especially is about to have that moment.
Yeah.
I almost think that we are getting caught with our pants down in a way. I don't think they've been able to ramp up for the need that's coming. And that's kind of our concern. But yeah, it's obviously a great opportunity. We know that people are going to be tearing out their lawns and putting in more drought tolerant plantings. Just a matter is a nursery trade. Like even we're trying to source plants on a project in Berkeley. We can't find a lot of the plants that we have specified just because they're not in stock, or like, you know, people aren't producing them, growing them. So yeah, it's already kind of hitting, unfortunately. So the only thing we can do is maybe start our own nursery.
Which we're trying to figure out how to do that now, but then also to encourage others. I feel like almost to turn your question, Sarah, not on its head, because you asked like, who, it's almost like, I think what the answer Thomas and Alan and I all gave were actually like, not like high-tech solutions. And I think where that kind of speaks to a greater cultural moment where technology has kind of done good, but has also gotten us into this mess. So actually like a return to, simpler would be the wrong term, but a return to like thoughtful local wisdom in many regards, I feel like is part of the zeitgeist that's of this moment that's coming. And like rejecting, like we're, to your point about the drought, Thomas, is we're trying to figure out how to build gardens without irrigation systems. And because what that ultimately does is creates gardens that are naturally resilient in ways that gardens that have irrigation systems are not. In the United States, it's been customary for, and we're very guilty of this. I'm hypocritical in saying this, but we're very guilty of building almost all the gardens on our websites have irrigation systems. Now we're starting to grapple with that and try to figure out, okay, part of what we need to do is be upfront with the client that we simply can only plant gardens during the 4 months of the year in which it's raining, and or you and your gardener need to hand water through establishment, but then like all these beautiful tributaries emerge in that now the homeowner is connecting with their own garden rather than outsourcing their garden maintenance, because they emotionally and philosophically start to connect with their garden because they're now in charge of it. And anyways, there's a lot of these interesting like reverberating effects that happen when you start to pick out why you do a thing a certain way.
So I want to actually bring up a question that came up from Saxon Holt, even though we're almost at time to take questions anyway. But I think that this comment about aesthetics is really tied into what you all are talking about right now. This question of a landscape that honors summer dormancy. And it interestingly ties back to this idea of death and fear of death. Is our fear of death like keeping us from understanding like seasonal cyclical appearance of plants? And to your points about the drought tolerant plants, many of those plants have a cycle of late summer dryness and dormancy. Is there a way for all of you as designers to possibly bring this conversation to the fore and allow people to appreciate? I've heard people say, brown is a color.
Client education, I think, right? I don't know.
I'd say we have no choice but to do it. So we'll find a way, we have to find a way. And I think that's our job as designers. It's communicating things. Eva?
Yes, okay. I had a thought on regarding death and all this I really liked your comment and the connection we have with nature, actually. And I was thinking that most of the people now are not even connected to nature. And thinking on the snake that you mentioned also, we're not even ready to accept nature with all the good and bad parts for us. So we can see it happen in the landscapes that people ask from us, that they might be more sustainable as years go on, but still, I can see it all around me that people are afraid of spiders, for example. And the other day I was in a really beautiful landscape and there were some huge spiders. And I was not even afraid of going close to them because they were part of this thing. And I had to play the game and maybe they could bite me or something. But when I saw a picture of the spider to a friend of mine, she was really, she was kind of afraid and she didn't even like the context. So this is an issue that it's really, I don't know, I'm thinking about it a lot, that from the one hand, we want all the beauty and resilience and the nice weather and the breeze and the beautiful sea, but on the other hand, we're not ready to accept all the tough reality that might come with it, like the example like the story with death that Thomas explained earlier. Okay, this is a general thought I had during the conversation.
So there's another interesting, oh, go ahead, Eva.
No, this is it. Thank you.
I was going to say, there's another interesting question that's popped up in the Q&A, which I think relates to this. Jason says, as an urban landscape designer, how do we create the sea change in denser urban areas to apply these practices? What are a few teachable items we can convey to potential clients? A lot of clients do not get it. And I think, this comment about the spider is very interesting because it seems like what several of you have alluded to is this idea of picking and choosing liking aspects of nature, but not necessarily fully being comfortable with nature, or there's parts of it we're rejecting, which I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Are there some ways to draw on that idea in communicating with clients?
The dormant is not dead. That's kind of a main I think, perception of clients that brown is dead, but brown is also just, it's in its dormant state. So like educating clients about that.
I think showing them built work, it's kind of twofold in that it's always been curious to me that like people move to Southern California for all these various reasons. They think it's beautiful and the weather's nice, but then when it comes time to make their garden, they want something that's completely detached from what you would see when you go hiking. And so I would think encouraging clients, or maybe asking clients like where they go to nature and why they find it beautiful, and then trying to unpack that, and then maybe giving it back to them in a kind way where it's like, well, if you go, and I'm of course my assumption here, which might not be true, is that everyone hikes, but ask them what they do and where they go, and kind of trying to more deeply understand why they find certain places beautiful, and then tie that back into like where they live. And to the point about the small, dense urban project, we actually try to make space in our body of work for really small projects, because if we're going to have meaningful ecological impact on our homes, cities, and regions, then actually we need to be firing on all fronts. And perhaps the dense urban project mostly needs that perhaps more than any. Thomas Rayner kind of calls this like the rewilding of our cities, which I've always admired, and he believes that like that's the next renaissance to come, and I'm hopeful that that's the same as well, because in a small space you can still have like a perhaps even more like wild, beautiful garden in which a homeowner can connect with nature and their land. But I think we all just need to like start chipping away at these like obsolete like notions of beauty on all fronts, whether large scale or small scale.
The only thing I would add to that is that I think we have a lot of allies out there with that we haven't really connected with yet. We had a similar discussion because we're doing a park in Athens that's eventually going to be humongous, and many people are involved, but the client is really resisting to letting it go dry in the summer, for example, to thinking it of as a real ecotope rather than a park. And we found out that there's kind of an NGO out there that cares for urban animals, and they're very good and intent on providing habitats for them. These people already have all the know-how and all the push to come to the table and say this is what needs to be done. And I think there are many others out there. So it's a time for alliances, probably.
Yeah.
There's a few interesting questions also popping up. One person is asking about native restorative landscapes in the high-end market. So, application where possibly we're seeing, or what I think the question is about trendiness. Does that drive the market in your opinion? Do we need to be seeing these sorts of projects taken up in the high-end market in order to perhaps filter down?
I would offer, unfortunately, yes. But how do I structure the answer to this? Unfortunately, like within a capitalist system, people tend to look for like the shiny object and the beautiful thing. The high-end market, because it is the high-end market and more dollars at stake, tends to have, in my humble opinion, a disproportionate kind of number of eyes on it through whatever like legacy media, magazines, or these things that kind of espouse like a lifestyle, without like digging deep into the fact that perhaps we're building homes that are inappropriate. I'll kind of not try and unpack this in this moment, but I think as garden designers, what we can do is surround a house that is high-end with native plants that are absolutely beautiful, that like appeal to people's senses of desire. I think we're going to win this battle through appealing to people's senses of desire rather than pity or charity. But the lovely thing is that, I mean, in your work, Thomas, and I would like to think in our work, is that these ecologically appropriate and resilient landscapes are stunning, and actually beat the dumb grass lawn quite easily in terms of their beauty. So I think that gives us hope in terms of like advocating for like a new, more ecological revolution.
So one of the follow-ups to some of these, installing some of these landscapes is the conversation about maintenance. And I know a lot that you all already touched on this a little bit. I know Christine is asking, is saying our maintenance practices and standards are really in crisis. I find this is such a challenging hurdle. Do you incorporate topics around maintenance with clients in the early steps? Is this, how can say the smaller design firm or really incorporate this conversation effectively?
Well, our office, sorry, go ahead, Thomas. Go ahead, Thomas.
I think in the beginning we made the mistake to say that more natural gardens and more resilient gardens would require less maintenance, while in fact they require a different kind of maintenance. And we found out pretty quickly that they were being maintained out of existence. So I think they do eventually require less maintenance, but you have to change the way people are doing things.
Completely, I agree with that. I mean, even in our projects, we've realized that the final day of the garden install is that's the first day of the garden. So we've now added a whole year to our contracts that like we come back once a month and kind of look at it and tweak it as needed, but also that we educate the gardener. These gardens aren't like the mow and blow kind of gardener requirement. They're kind of a different type of gardener. And so we can use existing gardeners. People are often attached emotionally to them, but we just need to educate them as the garden grows in how to maintain these, because they're completely different than just blowing the leaves and the grass kind of clippings.
So I think this actually is, this may tie interestingly into some of the conversations that David and Alan, you've had in the social realm, and thinking about starting to include some people in the conversation who are doing maintenance, and how are we, are there some ways to make sure that we're reaching the folks who are probably interested in this conversation and may not even feel invited to the table? And I'm curious if either of you have any specific thoughts on methods for that, and whether really even information being translated into Spanish might be a piece, or if there are other components there as far as really bringing people who are in those roles into the conversation, and not just going to the highest level of management in the conversation.
I would say that historically in the United States, the profession of the gardener has been kind of devalued in a way that is unfair and makes no sense to us. And that's kind of part of our land and labor initiative. But oftentimes, just to create a useful anecdote, when we finish a project on a smallish residential house in California, we kind of do it one of two ways. And the first is that we ask the client if they historically have had a relationship with the gardener. And to Alan's point, we meet them and we talk to them, and then we start to let them know that this is a different kind of project, and to put down the blower and to actually put the leaf litter back into the soil or back into the planting areas, because that's where lizards live and things like this. So to take them along with us for that journey feels important. But then there's also like a funny thing in that a lot of what gardeners do in the United States at present is like janitorial work. So, and that's actually also important as well, is that beyond like the actual gardening, there's a different, you can almost parcel out like landscape maintenance into two zones. One is gardening and the other is janitorial. And sometimes we'll let the gardener know that janitorial work still needs to happen and is important, but that then we kind of either have them take care of the gardening, or what we see emerging now, which gives us great hope, is that a lot of people like are realizing that whether they're miserable at their tech jobs or whatever it is, that they want to be back in the soil. So whether it's the clients or it's a more kind of a gardener with a little bit greater skill, then we bring them in as well. But ultimately, increasingly, we're realizing great power of the homeowner and or landowner being willing to do the maintenance themselves. And that on the residential project, usually the first question that we ask potential clients is, are you ready to become a gardener? Because then that almost guarantees a successful garden as well. But I'm not anti-gardener, we're pro-gardener. It's just that we're trying to reconnect homeowners with their land as well.
Thomas, I'm so curious for you to weigh in on this because you're coming from Athens, Greece, and I'm wondering if that idea of compensation for someone in a gardening role, it has a different lens where you are. We've been talking about this idea of, if there is if we were to elevate this role of people doing garden maintenance and, bring up the support and professionalism for that audience, maybe that changes the dialogue. Do you feel like the compensation or discussion around the value of those roles is different in Greece?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, I love David and Alan's and the whole team's work, and the writing is beautiful. But I think of all of the values that you guys espouse, I think what has blown my mind is the idea that we're part of an ecosystem, and we have to make sure that the ecosystem that we work with, meaning the people in our firms, the people implementing the work, etc., everyone has to be okay. We have to make sure that this kind of symbiosis works for everyone. So we're that's really knocking around my head. And the short answer, Sarah, is no. I think it's the same kind of, it's close to the bottom of the tent pole. Garden related designers, maintainers, contractors, they're always, the landscape contractor is the kind of one of the lowest contractors, the garden designer is one of the lowest designers, etc.
Do you see that changing? I mean, you all a few moments ago were talking about, a sea change in terms of design. Is this a question of waiting for that to filter down, or is there a way to lift up from a grassroots level?
There has to be a way. I mean, we have to, I think, David, maybe you guys have already thought about it.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to, we're trying to build gardens that are more egalitarian in that they're equally for the humans as they are for the birds, insects. So like that as the starting prompt, then like kind of reverberates out to an interest in a more egalitarian world. But Thomas and Alan and ourselves find ourselves in the place of garden making. So we are taking it upon ourselves to like think rigorously and interrogate like the totality of the systems that go into making a garden, which are labor, materials, botany, and land. And so, and we mentioned this on our call the other day, Sarah, where it's almost like environmental sustainability almost is preventing us from making even more meaningful change, because people go, but it's like a ecologically good garden. And it's like, well, who built it? And were they making living wages, or were they exploited in the process of making this garden? Because if that's the case, it's great that this garden is now environmentally sound, but like we're still, there's an elephant in the room that we're not addressing. So the way we're addressing it is by just going around and saying all the stuff as loudly as we can, and in the fact that the response has thus far been positive, that gives us great hope. And yeah, it's going to take time, but I so appreciate what you said, Thomas, about getting frustrated about it not happening soon enough. So I guess all we can do is keep charging.
Yeah, and I'd add to that there's I think another common ground between California and Greece, in that a lot of this work is being done by immigrants, so that exacerbates the condition even more.
Yep. So ultimately advocating for immigration reform and or understanding how much, when you, in the vetting process of interviewing somebody for a job, asking tough questions, like how much do you pay your guys? And if you don't, if you don't like that answer, figuring out how you can, maybe even on this job, how we can do better by the guys who are digging the holes for the plants.
Well, I think we are out of time and we're going to have to end it there. But I have to say, this has been very inspiring. And I realize that you're talking about big challenges, and, climate change and social equity are not easy problems. They're difficult ones. And I really appreciate the perspectives that everyone today has brought to us. And Pacific Horticulture very much wants to support these kinds of dialogues, and love having the cultural exchange component of this as well. So thank you all so much. Thank you to all of our members who have come today and asked fabulous questions, more fabulous questions than we even had time to answer. So please stay with us in this dialogue. We're going to continue this conversation in our discussion platform, in our member portal. We will absolutely continue to have chats about this in many different forums. So thank you all again for having lunch or dinner with us, as the case may be. And we hope you'll join us next time for our next event.
And
So
thank
nice
you
to
for
meet-
bringing us all together, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Thomas
so
and
much.
Ava, hopefully this is a start of a longer conversation and friendship. You guys are awesome. So happy to know you.
Happy to know you.
It was nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.